Good afternoon. Let the record show we have a quorum present. I'd like to call the committee back to order and invite the sergeant to bring in the witness, Mr. Ali Fumoy. Hello.
Am I?
Okay. Mr. Ali, thanks for coming for your second session. And just to remind you that you took an oath in the beginning, not to suggest that I believe in any way you haven't honored that oath in your early appearance to this committee, but just for the records. You're back here today to discuss the same thing we were doing last week, and we have listened to the people that you regulate, and I think we have an abundance of questions for you. So I'll invite Mr. Chris to lead off, and I'll follow after him.
First of all, I really wanted to state for the record the gratitude for your attendance, because I know you're supposed to be off today. So the fact that you can come in and when you get some of your much needed rest, it's really appreciated. I know that, well, I'll take the assumption that you guys have been listening and following the proceedings. And as we have said before consistently, we do recognize, well, two things. One, I think we all agree the market needs to be regulated. So I don't think that's in dispute, in terms of regulation versus non-regulation. And going back to the purpose as to why we're here, is to look at the effectiveness and efficiency of off-reg. Now, as it stands right now, we do have our existing laws, and it is what we have right now. And our job now as legislators is to make sure the law and the regulations are as robust as possible to regulate the industry that it is in. We also do recognize the limitations, and that was even earlier with Mr. Monroe's testimony, where we found out that the team that he has for the area that he has to regulate is just wholly insufficient. And that will forever be the case in terms of regulators. But for the resources that we have, the most important thing is to make sure that we use that the best way that we can. And it appears from different testimonies and listening to different witnesses, there seems to be a serious mismatch in terms of the skills that the regulator need versus what we need to apply within the industry. And one of the first things that jumps out is even on the regulatory legal side. We're listening to C3, and they have the lawyers there also as directors and everything else. And we now understand from the testimony yesterday that the case that Off-Reg lost was a result of a technicality where something wasn't done or something should have been done. And the first thing that jumped to my mind when I heard that was, well, what is your regulatory lawyer doing? So these are the kind of things where we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. So with that said, and just kind of explaining the rationale for my first question, what do we need to do? And sorry, to kind of backtrack, when we understand now that the regulators are writing letters to licensees that are outright being ignored, that's what we've been made to understand, that Off-Reg has written to Flow concerning the access to the ducts and different things, and they've been outright ignored. The next question then is, like, first of all, what is the next step in the process? Because if we have a regulator being ignored, then clearly there's something wrong with our laws or something wrong with our regulations, but our laws can't be ignored. Our regulator can't be ignored. So what then is the next recourse? What then is the next step?
Mr. Chairman, Ali Fa'amoy, Executive Director, ICT. We have an enforcement pyramid that is the standard for regulators worldwide. And the first step is writing a letter of warning. The next step is civil penalties, and it goes on and on up until suspension of the license or perhaps criminal prosecution, depending on the nature of the offense. The issues that were reported as sort of the regulator being ignored is just issues that we need to chase up on. We constantly have issues with licensees that are in different stages of either investigation or enforcement. So we'll have people who are a few days late submitting reports. It's not something you necessarily want to launch a full-on fine for, but you do then write to them and let them know that they're in breach and give them a warning that if they don't comply, that other steps will follow. Sometimes it's because a staff member is off, or because of COVID, there's some delays or what have you. So it's not that everybody is 100% compliant all the time. We generally have licensees who are in different stages of non-compliance, and all of those are being addressed.
Yeah, but what is the time period in terms of like between warning? Because you wrote a letter, I think it was like a few months back. I think it was like one of them may have been from 2019 to Flow. We're now in July. That has basically been ignored. So then the question is, what time period do you go from being nice with a letter versus going to a warning versus going to the next step? Like, how long does that whole process take? We've seen fuel, it takes like over a year. A tank gets on fire, it takes over a year to find them because an investigation is being done when out of the country. So I was in fear, but that still take a year for something that obvious. Then the question is, if something isn't that obvious, how long would it really take?
It depends on the nature and the complexity of the issue. That particular issue has been investigated, and we are struggling with our legal team to figure out how to take it forward.
When you say struggling the legal team, because you guys pay what, $5, $6, $7 million a year in royalties to the government, plus on top of that, the fees that you expense in the normal course of your business in the ICT sector. Correct me if I'm wrong, but those fees over the quarter, I think is it actually regulatory fees or one of those where you basically spread that cost amongst the different licensees?
The license fee for our, what we call major licensees, telcos and broadcasters, consists of two components. A regulatory fee, which covers our cost, which is split amongst all of the licensees, and royalties,
Yep.
which are assessed based on their gross turnover, validated by us, and then basically it's a pass-through to the government. So we collect it on behalf of the government. The regulatory fees don't change much because it's based on our costs, but if our costs go up, those regulatory fees will go up.
Okay, that's the point I want to get to. That cost does not also include your legal costs.
That cost covers everything my sector needs or should require to execute its function.
So the next question is then, if you go and you get some of those high-powered lawyers that cost money to actually win case, they don't lose on technicality, isn't that cost then allowed to be inside your fees to be recouped to charge those other guys?
Yes.
So then the next question is then, if that is the case, because I guarantee you the first quarter in which your legal fees go up and a couple of those guys see that their regulatory fees, which you recoup from them, has gone up, the first thing they're going to do is pick up the phone and say, well, what hell is this? At that point, you can say, well, go and ask this one because they're the one who are allowing us to rack up all of these fees. Like, what's stopping you guys from going out, bringing in the QCs, bringing in the silks, and basically taking these people to town and letting them pay for the lawyers that you just brought in? In other words, if you bring in the lawyers, they got to pay for it. You paying for it. They don't got to pay for it.
We had specialized legal contractors, and we were told to get rid of them.
Yeah, but that's cost that was still being, those lawyers are needed to help you guys regulate that industry. Let's be realistic. I mean, we saw yesterday, Flow came down here. I mean, Digicel sent one person. Flow brought a whole armada. So you kind of see exactly how deep their bench goes. I mean, how many people do you have on the ICT team?
7 of us.
And how much people Flow had yesterday? That's just one. How much people Flow brought yesterday?
I
Probably
don't
about
know.
the same number. At least about 70 people Flow. I mean, how many people? Zoom, they had. Yeah. You're off mic. Yeah. So the flip side, the point I'm making here then is that the law allows you to get the lawyer or the legal representation that you need. So who was it that made the decision then to get rid of these people where the cost is being sent back to those very same people?
The board at that time.
So not the current board, the previous board.
Yes,
So
sir.
have you gone back to the current board then to get the resources needed to bring in the high-powered people to basically get these issues sorted? Because I'm going to tell you right now, having our regulator ignored is not acceptable. That's already a no-go. And the board must recognize that if they make a ruling and it's going to be ignored at that wholesale level, then in essence, you have now made the organization ineffective. And the reason why I'm saying what I'm saying is I go back to the issue with Cayman 27, which was already in the public domain, where I can tell you one licensee told me point blank, if that one ain't paying, I ain't paying. And the minute one ain't paying, it starts that domino effect. So the point is, the minute you start allowing one person to get away, this creates a domino effect where everybody's going to start pushing the envelope. So the next question then in all of that, having said that, is when is the new proposal going to be taken to the board to start stepping up or ramping up the whole issue on these guys? Because the way I look at it is this, and not being disrespectful to the other sectors or the other colleagues. Your area of ICT is one of the longest, most established areas in terms of regulation. You guys should be taking the lead. When I say you guys, I'm referring to ICT, and the others should be following. They should be learning from what it is that you guys have done, because you guys went through all the growing pains of having a new entity and sorting things out. But if the most mature, strongest area is being ignored, then what hope is there for fuels that just started out and that's just 3 years old? So the question then is, when can we expect that proposal to go to the board to get the necessary legal firepower to basically deal with the Flow or the likes of Flow or anybody else who's looking to challenge the regulator?
Thursday, the 30th of July.
I can live with that. And now the next question I need to ask, now recognize that this is a specialized skill. Are you guys going to go through this long tendering process now to go find somebody, or you find people who win cases?
Procurement is not my area, sir.
Yeah, but regulatory part of it is. So what I'm trying to understand is this, like, what is the process then of basically finding the proper regulatory lawyer to go deal with this issue? What would be the process?
I would imagine we'd have to do a tender under procurement law, describe the nature of the engagement, and seek someone who has the requisite experience.
But I thought the procurement law are kicking like maybe, was it 250, is it 250,000? How much is 100,000? So the retainer for someone like, yeah, but it does allow for single, yeah. So from that start, okay, so Thursday that is going there. So the next couple of months, then we'll expect some kind of action to be, we can expect some action or some progress to be made on this issue with regards to the bigger guys trying to keep the smaller guys out.
I would hope so. Mr. Chairman, we have a number of investigations that have been done, and determinations need to be written, and it's not happening. So I would hope we would expedite this matter as soon as we can.
One of the other things that jump out, I know just, you have something on this subject? Before, Okay, well, I won't change the subject yet. That's fine.
Your answer said that determinations need to be made. Is that where you need the expertise in order to write these determinations so you can implement them, and you simply do not have the resources to do it?
That is correct. My team is primarily made up of technical professionals, engineers who have different backgrounds in different technical areas. And you then rely, this is common amongst regulators, you then rely on a regulatory legal team to help you then frame your determinations under the relevant statutes, under the relevant regulations, and take it forward. You are a quasi-judicial entity as a regulator, so your judgments are effectively court orders or judgments of a court, the equivalent. So they need to be properly executed, and I don't have those resources within my team because my team is technical.
And the board has not seen fit to provide you with these resources. They have made you get rid of the resources you had. Who could do that for you?
The specialized resources that we were employing to do a number of things, including reviewing the ICT licensing framework under which all the telcos and FM broadcasters sit, and which is now quite old for ICT terms, over 15 years old. That work was halted.
And is that one of the reasons why cable and wireless flow are running on extensions as opposed to a full license?
Yes. There was testimony as well, Mr. Chairman, that there was a link between the significant market power review and the renewal of licenses. That is not the case. The two issues are not conflated. In the European Union, when you have a dominant provider, especially in the telco space, they typically do SMP, significant market power reviews, every 3 years or so. We've never done one in Cayman. So we are going on a decade and a half now without having done the requisite SMP. So it's taking a lot longer than it would normally take. I'm frustrated by how long it's taking, but when the market was liberalized, this is another word that was used in testimony yesterday, the entire industry was liberalized. However, the incumbent, and this happens every time you liberalize a marketplace, the incumbent was dominant from day one in certain areas. Over time, we got competition in mobile, we got competition in broadband, we got competition in various other areas. As those services, which economists call markets, become competitive, they're shift into a different category within our framework. There still remains a number of markets, if you will, that it is assumed that cable and wireless flow is still dominant in. But we need to test that using a very official and prescribed significant market power evaluation, and that process is going on. One of the markets, for example, that we believe is still dominated by flow is something called fixed line, which is equivalent to the plain old telephone service, the copper line that comes into your house. That was liberalized, but nobody's decided to build, not surprisingly, an expensive copper network. Nobody does that anymore. As you heard testimony from our licensees yesterday, fiber is actually cheaper than copper. So we need to go through that process, but that is specific to the areas where flow remains dominant. It has nothing to do with the overall entire framework that needs to be modernized and upgraded, and that work is a very, very heavy lift, especially for a small regulator, and requires, again, specialized assistance. And it's just taking us a long time because we don't have the skills.
Mr. Chairman, sorry.
Mr. Chairman,
if I could just interrupt just a minute without a question. I'm not asking a question. Mr. Chairman, as you are aware, once again, we have the challenge of simultaneous meetings happening at the same time. Councillor White and myself will have to beg leave. But certainly on behalf of the government, Councillor Connolly will remain so that you can maintain quorum. But we do apologize to the committee and the witnesses. You'll ask my questions for me. Well, you surely don't have a problem with that.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, through you. Earlier on, when my colleague, Mr. Saunders, was saying something to you about the legal team or whatever, you said you were told to dismiss them. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, sir. The contractors that we had at the time who were specialized in those areas, we had to let go.
And who did those instructions come from, sir?
The board at the time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, that's it. Once again, the board.
Just to follow up a little bit on what Chris, we were given evidence yesterday by C3 that while they have been allowed by Cable and Wireless or Flow to use their ducts along the 7 Mile Beach corridor, I think it was, right? They have since applied to use their ducts in the Eastern District. And they say they could produce emails where they had agreed for 1.5 inches inner duct, I think was the word they used. And they went and purchased this 1.5 inch inner duct. Now Cable and Wireless is refusing to let them use that 1.5 inch inner duct because they're claiming that what they agreed to was a 1 inch inner duct, and it is holding up their progress. And that you as a regulator has told Cable and Wireless that they need to allow them to insert this 1.5 inch duct, but Cable and Wireless is ignoring you.
Mr. Chairman, the matter that you refer to, along with related matters, are part of an investigation and a determination which is pending. I think it would be inappropriate for me to speak any more definitively on it
Well,
until we complete that.
That's because the other one that they complained about was the frustration of being able to put some kind of a switch on where Maya 1 comes up in East End, and everything that they've offered Cable and Wireless to do, they have found some excuse. They wanted to use their building, no, they didn't have space. They got a couple of acres of land, they wanted to put up their own building on the land, they couldn't do that. And they're saying that the inability to put that switch there and have certain accesses, I don't know the technical jargon, is hampering the service that they can offer to their customers, in particular in the Eastern districts.
Without commenting on the specificity of that, which is also part of a dispute that is ongoing, I can say to you that this issue of infrastructure sharing is a known impediment to competition worldwide, which is why as soon as the regulator was formed, the ICTA, infrastructure sharing regulations were put in place in 2003. We still use those regulations, 2003 regulations, because this is a well-trodden path, it is well understood, and the concept of infrastructure sharing, whether it is a pole, manhole, duct, building, tower, it's very well understood, and it is under those regulations that we are looking very carefully at statements and problems such as the one you've referenced, if that's general enough without being prejudicial.
Just wanted to confirm that what they had told us, that they had made this dispute complete, I think they called it, and because I had to tell Mr. Mary that he seemed like a very disputable guy, right? But I just wanted to confirm that what they were doing was in fact telling us what's happening to them, and they did say that they're waiting on the ruling from the ICTA. And your position is that you just do not have the expertise in-house to do that in a reasonable, short, effective way.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry, just going back to the access to the Maya 1. That's one of the things that came up yesterday. Now, we were made to understand from Flo's testimony that they were basically told that they can go build something or off to the side or something and get access to it. Is that normal in this situation? Because we were under the impression that it was just one piece of some equipment that needed to go someplace, as opposed to going out and building something massive. I mean, what's the story there? Or is that also something that's on a dispute too?
Those
If it's on an investigation, please, we don't want you to say anything to.
Those specific issues I can't speak to. What I can tell you is that the concept of infrastructure sharing is all based on available space. If you have space available on a tower, in a duct, in a building, you must share it. That is the basic tenet. What we've seen in other markets where incumbents block competitors' access or leverage their dominance and act in an anti-competitive fashion has been things like insisting that a competitor build another facility when there is already an existing ICT facility that could accommodate the competitor. It may sound unfair that you have to share your building that you've invested, but it has been proven that infrastructure sharing is one of the key elements of lowering the barrier to competition and enabling the consumer at the end of the day to benefit from that competitive market.
So in terms of the sharing, who is it that would determine the cost of that sharing? How is that normally determined?
That comes back to some of the original assessments that were done when the market was liberalized back in the early 2000s, where I think you had some testimony around this, where there were arguments about the methodology to use. Initially, there was something called the FAC model, fully allocated cost, but the regulator and the industry moved to an agreement that what would be used by and large was the FLIRIC model, the forward-looking, long-run incremental cost model, which is a better, a fairer apportioning of costs over time, includes depreciation and so forth. So the FLIRIC model would be your basis for assessing whatever cost there might be, whether it's interconnection costs or infrastructure sharing costs. But the bottom line is it needs to be fair. The other principle within infrastructure sharing is if I'm the incumbent and you're the competitor, I cannot charge you anything above what I would charge anyone else or even myself. So if there's an internal cost that I bear, that must be the cost, it has to be cost-based, the cost that I charge my competitors, and I cannot charge one competitor more than I would charge another. It's just a simple principle of fairness.
Going back to the cost issue then and the whole data link and the pole issue, we understand there's about maybe 5,000 poles to make ready. Now we understand from one witness that originally when they looked at that model, the cost would have been about $200 per pole. Now it's up to $1,600 where they're paying $800 and the other person's paying $800. I mean, how did that, I mean, using the same model, how did that initial cost went from 200, assuming it was at the 200, to the 1,600 that it is for each pole? I mean, that seems like a serious increase in cost.
Mr. Chairman, on my first day of testimony, I mentioned that we had discovered 6 key areas that the industry had problems with in terms of pole attachment, and we went to determination on 1. The industry was basically brought together when I joined the ICTA in 2014, and this was a major issue, and we brought all the parties together to basically try to identify what the problems were and find solutions. The industry basically pointed out these are some of the key areas, which included things like the cost, how the cost was assessed, the time frames involved, et cetera, et cetera. There's a number of issues that were raised at that time. So without getting into, again, specificity of what may or may not be a potential dispute or investigation, what I would say is that the industry has some very standardized approaches to how these costs are determined. But what is driving, we believe, a lot of these costs is the methodology of pole attachment. That methodology is for vertical pole attachment, where you have to vertically separate the power from the communication space. In other markets, a much more cost-effective methodology has been chosen, which is horizontal attachment. You simply put a T-bar up, and everyone attaches at the same height, which is fair, on a T-bar, which then drastically reduces the costs associated with make-ready.
We were given evidence that part of that increase was because originally they were only catering for one connection, and whatever the dynamic and forces that would create on an existing pole. Now that they have to cater for 4, that ups it because sometimes they may have to strengthen the pole, put in a guy wires on another pole to resist the cross tension. So that was part of how they were justifying. Is that reasonable? But that sounded that could be overcome as well by your T-bar, but it would probably need some additional guy wires and strengthening as well.
That testimony is entirely accurate. There's obviously engineering work that needs to go in. The more attachments you put on a pole, whether it's fiber, copper, or power, it doesn't matter. The wind load becomes an issue. Doing a horizontal attachment doesn't eliminate those issues, but it does change them, and we believe it reduces the challenge, shall we say, and can then have an impact on cost. What we'd like to see is the industry explore it and see if it could not be faster, quicker, and cheaper alternative, again, where the consumer could then benefit from the rollout of these licensees who want to roll out. They want to build their networks island-wide. They want to expand, but they're meeting significant challenges.
Sir, going back to the and this is one of the things that's a bit lost on when they said that the poles were designed for one carrier as opposed to 4. The question then, is it now that all 4, or is it that there are 4 carriers that's looking to run broadband throughout the whole country, or is it a situation where one is running a multi-mode type fiber, where a couple of them can connect to the same fiber? I mean, is it that all 4 is now looking to run the same fiber cabling?
Our understanding is that they all want to build their own separate physical network.
So going back to the concept of infrastructure sharing then, I mean, isn't it possible one fiber can be shared between couple carriers?
Theoretically, yes, it is possible for it to be shared, but I think it starts getting really, really technical when you start to look at the different architectures that they employ. So for example, Flow has a hybrid network where they deploy fiber out to a cabinet, and then the last couple hundred yards, last mile is what we call it, could possibly be copper to the house, but you have fiber to the curb or fiber to the cabinet. That is a different architecture than other licensees are building, where they build a pure fiber network straight to the home. So the type of equipment they have in the field is very different. The type of mounting that they need is different. Some of them can mount their equipment on a pole, whereas other types of equipment need a roadside cabinet because of the size, the standby power, the connectivity, and so forth. So theoretically, it's possible for them to share fiber optic cable infrastructure, yes. But it then gets very complicated, and you then have a cost benefit. Is this really worth the effort?
Yeah, but they can share to a certain point.
Yeah.
I mean, because at the CUC pole level, they can share at that point. It is when you're coming off the pole and away from the pole, that's where it becomes, that's where it becomes a little bit complicated or whatever, but.
It depends on where that cable is in the architecture. So if you think of a tree, if the cable is more of a distribution point from, say, central Georgetown up to Bordentown, then it's more of a trunk. If it's closer to the customer who would be the leaf on the tree, further out on one of the branches, then it's a whole different story.
No, I kind of get that, but I mean, I can understand why CUC is feeling the way they're feeling now, because if 4 people want to come put these trunks on my pole, then naturally I can understand now. I mean, anyway, I'm not going to belabor that point. One of the things I wanted to touch on separately going back to the Maya 1 and the whole access. The Maya 1 ownership, if I remember something right, was a consortium of different companies. So in other words, by the virtue of providing that cable, they're in essence providing an ICT service in Cayman. Or am I stretching here?
Both submarine cables were designed and began construction before the ICTA was even created. So they're...
Sorry, to kind of put it in, the reason why I asked the question I did is that I understand that CUC had to go out and get, get an ICT license because prior to the liberalization, they basically had permission from Cable and Wireless to do their fiber network so they can communicate. And once the market became liberalized, they then had to apply because they were operating in essence within the ICT space. They had to then go and get their own ICT license.
That's correct.
So if CUC had fiber throughout the country and had to get, or if CUC had fiber that was being used and had to get an ICT license, then the question I'm trying to get at here is if the Maya 1 is still on island providing an ICT service, the question is who are that consortium of companies? Is it one company that they created? Does that company have a license, or is it like who basically license? Where's the license for the Maya 1? I mean, that's in a nutshell. Where's the license for that?
CNW has the license for both CGFS and Maya.
Okay, so but the owners of, but CNW doesn't own the Maya 1. Who owns the Maya? Who owns the Maya?
The original consortium was maybe a dozen different companies. There's been a lot of consolidation within the telecom space globally. There might be 3 or 4 owners of Maya 1 now.
So the revenue made on the Maya 1 from whoever owns it, that you're supposed, that the ICT is supposed to get royalties from. I'm just trying to understand how you get your royalties from that part of the Maya 1. Like who pays that revenues minus costs for gross adjusted revenue?
In very simple terms, Mr. Chairman, a submarine cable back in the old days with multiple owners was like a strata. So there were common areas like the cable terminal and the repeaters, but the bandwidth that each owner had access to was effectively their apartment in the condo strata. Some had big apartments, some had smaller ones. So the money they might make off of their portion of the cable was theirs, entirely theirs. They would have to contribute now to the operating costs of the cable. So there would be a holding company set up that would be responsible for ensuring the system, maintaining the operating stations at both ends or multiple ends, paying the power bill on the cable that needed to be powered from various stations in order to put power on the cable to feed the repeaters, and hiring a cable ship to go run repairs if something was to happen. So there would be a holding company like a strata management company that would maintain the facility, if you will, but the individual bandwidth allocations were owned separately by each of the constituent owners. That model is less common these days. These days, telcos don't even build cable systems anymore. The likes of Facebook and Google are building cable systems these days, so they tend to be a lot simpler in their financial and legal structure than these older cables currently are.
So in essence then, using your example, the strata manager is who's paying all the strata fees to everybody? Or is that the situation where he's paying the fees to everybody? Or, because what I'm trying to get here is there revenues being made from the use of the Maya 1 cable that the ICT is not getting? I'm trying to understand if the ICT is getting their fair share of the revenues being made of that Maya 1 cable. That's what I'm trying. So I'm trying to understand.
I understand. The way it's licensed right now, yes. What we're not entirely clear on is what the role is, the exact relationship between the Maya 1 consortium and its constituent owners, such as Cable and Wireless. Because we only see one of the landing stations and one of its small footprint. And typically, nobody's buying capacity from here to Columbia on Maya 1, which you could do, but nobody wants that. Everyone's focused on that northbound capacity.
No, the only reason I ask the question is that it goes back to, for the telcos that you regulate, it is revenues minus the direct costs is what it is that you pay your tax on. And because all of them pretty much have the direct costs of using the cable, then I was trying to figure out the revenue portion of it, because between cable and wireless and digital, what is revenues to one and expense to the other? As both two regulators, they will basically cancel each other out, because one will get it as a deduction and one pays it on the revenue side. Here, it's a cost, but I'm just trying to understand where the revenue goes above to make sure that we're getting that piece of the revenue that we're supposed to be getting. So is that revenue then part of cable and wireless's revenue? And then they basically, you pay on that, or is a situation where, sorry, excuse me, or is a case where those guys already have that cost, but who recognizes the revenue? So cable and wireless charges it to them, but the question is that when cable and wireless then pays it out to the other owners, is that then deducted as part of their cost? I'm just trying to understand that relationship, just to make sure that we're not leaving any money on the ground that could be going to help other people here. That's what I'm just trying to understand.
Because the Maya 1 consortium is not licensed here, Cable and Wireless is, we don't see those financials. You are right that all of the licensees take a deduction if they're paying or paying for services from another licensee, so we don't double tax, if you will, on the royalties. But because we don't have a license for Maya 1, we don't see the level of detail that you're asking for.
So then the question is, why don't they have a license?
It's a good question.
Okay, so that's fine. That's something to look into. That.
It predates the establishment of the ICTA, so it would take some research to.
So does CUC's
CUC.
fiber too.
That was a lot easier, I must say.
I have a question in terms of the providers. It appears that the providers have what you refer to as curbside or something, right? But that curbside may be available along a street. But not everybody is allowed to hook up to the fiber. It seems like there's, and I want to use this carefully, because information I have suggests that there is a socioeconomic decision, and maybe the square footage size of the house, whether you get hooked up or not. And even people who ask to be hooked up are being told, well, we want to have it here, we don't have it there yet, but we know that the house next door or a little ways up the road has fiber. Is there anything the regulator can do to make some kind of level playing field that wherever fiber is available by the provider, anyone who wants it can get it? I mean, we understand they have to pay for it. If you don't pay for it, you won't get it, but...
The consumer protection regs would help us address that. And we're hoping to we're sending those to Cabinet very shortly.
Yeah. One of the things that I was curious about, and this goes back again to building out Cayman infrastructure, and the reason why this became an issue for me is our two largest operators in the ICT space is Flow and Digicel. Now, looking at Digicel recent financial challenges, where I think they had to declare bankruptcy in one and restructure something to reduce their debt. Then I also look at the financial statements of Liberty that owns pretty much Cable and Wireless, Flow, and everybody else, and see that there's consistent loss. I am beginning to question then the ability of both companies over the long term, based on their existing model, based on their existing financial challenges or the current financial challenges and what impact that they may have on the future, because we need to make sure that we have companies that, in essence, have the deep pocket and the will to invest in Cayman. And with both companies now seeming to be having financial challenges based on what has been reported in the media, the question then is, what are we doing to incentivize, or is there anything being considered to incentivize companies to invest in Cayman? No. Digicel reported yesterday that over the last 10 years, they invested around $40 million in capital in Cayman. And Cable and Wireless, well, Flow, testified that over the last 10 years, they invested about $100 million in capital. 150? 150? I think they said 100 million. Was it okay? 100 million. Yeah, I was right. 100 million. Over the last 10 years, I'm just curious now. So in essence, between Digicel and Cable and Wireless, there's $140 million in capital investment over the last 10 years. But the chairman has already indicated several times publicly that for where he lives in North Side, he can't get proper service. So I'd be curious to know where the $140 million for both companies were invested over the last 10 years. You know what I mean? And why then do we still have the quote unquote some of the infrastructure challenges that we do have today?
Mr. Chairman, I can confirm that, well, as you know, we see the financials of our major licensees in order to assess royalties. The average capital investment over the last 10 years across the entire industry is just under 20 million.
Back up. Hold on.
Average.
20 million each, or 20 million, so 20 million for each of them. So how much licensees do you have? You're talking about two?
Four.
Four. So you're talking about $80 million investment over the last 10 years. 20 million per year, you said?
That is the...
That'd be 200 million then.
So if I do some quick math here, excuse me.
Is it 20 million over 10 years or 20 million for each of them over the 10 years, which would have basically it would be 80 million over 10 years?
Over the last 10 years, the industry has made $212 million of CapEx investment.
212. So
Yes, but that, remember now, we had other licensees in the space. They have since merged. So we went from a point where we had 6 telcos.
yeah, no, that's why I started in 2009, because in
In
2009, in 2009, how many we had?
We had 6 telcos.
In 2009. Okay, and between 2009 and 2019, they invested a total of 212 million, and that's on average 4. And that's US, right?
CI.
That's 212 CI, okay. That's about, okay. So about 260 million US. So 140 million of that was basically Cable and Wireless and Digicel.
Before I
They
say yes or
testified on the
no.
oath, you know. They were on the oath when they gave those numbers, I mean, ballpark-ish. I don't expect them to be to the cent. I don't hear 50, 60 million becomes 100.
$46 million for one, 10 million for another.
That don't include CUC, include data link included in that?
No.
Okay, just making sure.
I'm just doing some quick math.
That's fine.
Mr. Chairman. So between the four, it would be, and I can't tell you which is which because these numbers
And that's fine, that's
are
fine.
submitted in confidence. 10 million, 34, 91, and 53.
So 10 million, 94, no, 10 million, 90,
34, 91, and 53, rounding up.
okay. Okay, that's fine. And that's where you got the 212 over the last 10 years. Then, well, have you guys done any analysis then? Because it seems like they have probably rebuilt an entire network based on what the initial costs were. Have you guys done an analysis then in terms of, similar to what CUCs basically encourage for in terms of a reasonable rate of return on their investment? Because you look at the size of CUC's balance sheet, and they're making around, I think, 5% of their net profit is about 5% of their property, plant, and equipment in terms of, as reported in their annual financial statement. Have we guys looked at the balance sheet for these telcos, look at a percentage of their property, plant, and equipment, their investment, their capital, and so forth, and determine what percentage in terms that they're actually making as a profit?
No. They're
Okay.
not price related. It's a liberalized marketplace. You are very concerned about that when you have a monopoly like CUC or Water Authority or Cayman Water, where a very specific geography has been defined and they've been given a license which is exclusive. So as a regulator, you're very worried about their costs, which feed into their prices because you regulate their prices. We do not regulate the prices in the ICT space. There are only a few areas, as I mentioned before, where cable and wireless remains dominant that we price regulate. Until we can demonstrate that there is competition in those specific markets, we continue to price regulate them, but it's only a few markets. The vast majority of markets in the ICT space are fully liberalized, and we therefore do not price regulate.
Okay, no, not looking at price regulate. The point I'm trying to get at is this. We're worried about our infrastructure and in terms of its ability to grow in the next 5, 10 years in terms of basically building a super highway throughout the entire country. Now, what I'm looking for with the information that you would have collected or worked out is at that point, this is where the advice can then go to cabinet to say basically, if over the last 10 years of 212 million, if the majority of it has gone into the mobile space, in terms of on the mobile side, in terms of, well, digital will all be pretty much mobile or whatever, in terms of building that. And ultimately, the government policy, at least I would like to assume that the government policy is that by a set year, say 2030, they would like to make sure the Cayman Islands is pretty much positioned, or 2030, 2035, whatever, is that the Cayman Islands is positioned where every home is pretty much access to a super highway. It means then that the infrastructure investment needs to start be built from now. And based on the analysis that you would have done, this is where you can say to cabinet, well, of this 212 million, 200 million or 180 million is in the mobile space. And if we want more fiber to the home, and that kind of stuff, then the question is, based on that information, the policy can then be made to say, well, you know what? For companies that do this, here is where the incentive going to come from, because you want to use the fees that you have and the room that you have to wiggle to incentivize companies to invest in the way you want to go. So it's one thing for the market to provide a service today that's fully liberalized, but at the end of the day, as policymakers, you want us to make sure that we are positioned in Cayman to be at a point, because I gotta be honest with you, the 220, in the year 2020, where we have the 13 highest broadband speed in the world, and for the speeds that we're getting and for what we're paying, there is no way that the infrastructure that should be in broadband has been made, and especially now in this new world where more people are either working from home, kids doing stuff and everything online, we need to see the numbers that can say, well, you know what? Here's what the policy needs to be. Here's what we're going to encourage the companies to go. You know, this can be duty-free. This you don't pay royalties on. This you don't do that. To basically start incentivizing companies, because I feel bad when I see companies like C3 that is looking to push fiber to the home, which is ideally where we want the Cayman Islands to go. I would love that by the year 2030, every single home in the Cayman Islands have fiber to it. I would love that. But if the one company that's been offering it is having this struggle, then the question is, where do we go? Where do we see ourselves in the next 10 years? And that's why I said in terms of looking at these numbers, because if I find out that somebody is also making a ton load of money on old decrepit write-off assets that have already been paid for 4 or 5 times over, and you're still charging the fees that you're charging now, come now, that can't be progressive in any country. And so that's really more the information I'm looking at, is how do we incentivize companies? Because part of your remit is also to provide that analysis to cabinet, give them that advice to say, well, here's where we think we need to be getting, or where is it we're going. And that's where I'm looking at more from that standpoint.
From the information that we have, there's no lack of interest in this country. There's no lack of investment in the country. There's no, the regulatory intervention, which is what you're describing in order to promote or create incentives. The regulatory intervention that is needed is to remove the roadblocks that the telcos are facing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's access to ducts or access to infrastructure of all different types. That is where the regulatory intervention needs to happen, because each of the competitive telcos have made it very clear they want to invest. They want to go to the BRAC. They want to go to East End. They want to service every customer in Cayman. And what we have seen in our analysis is that they, as a group, are spending 20% of their turnover on CapEx, on average, year on year. That's a significant investment that these entities are making. They employ hundreds of people directly, and they contribute or indirectly contribute to the jobs of thousands of others. So what they need, and I think what they deserve, is quality regulation. We need to do a better job of clearing the roadblocks out of the way, because they want to build their networks out, but they're being hampered.
Hold on, second, you just said a while ago that they're using 20% of their turnover on CapEx. You have just basically confirmed to me that over the last 10 years, based on 2012 CapEx, that they have made $1 billion in turnover in the last 10 years.
I can't confirm or deny that.
No, but I'm just saying, I just want you to know that my brain slipped out. So $1 billion in revenues in the telcos, that doesn't include data link over the last 10 years. And 200, okay, I got you, that's fine. You have a question, Mr. Chairman?
The question, I guess, we would like to find out from you, then, Mr. Daly, is what can this committee do to try to strengthen your position and to help you get, if it's, do you need additional legal framework, or is your problem simply one of manpower, expertise? Resources that you need is manpower, expertise, right? And from what we have seen of your income, you seem to be generating the income that if the board would allow you to have these resources, you can pay for the resources from your income. You don't need to be subsidized by government.
We're not subsidized
I know
by government. Mr. Chair, number one, what you can do is continue to have these types of honest hearings and fora. Number two, continue to support the good work of the Auditor General, who points out these areas of deficiency in RSAGC and others. I would say we need specific types of skill sets. I can't speak for the other sectors. They would have specific needs of their own. And to the member's point earlier, we are at a different maturity stage of regulation. We've been at this for 15 years. Water is just getting started. Fuel is just getting started. So it is somewhat unfair to compare the sectors at times, because they're in very different stages. They have very different players. There's not the level of competition in those sectors that you have in the ICT space. So they will obviously have their own requirements. I need very specific skill sets to deliver the quality regulation that I think the people of the country need and deserve, and frankly, that the industry deserves. They're putting their money where their mouth is year after year after year, and they deserve a better quality regulation.
Because from where we sit, as representative of the public, I can assure you that 90% and greater of all the complaints we get is about the telecom sector. As opposed to, we get the constant one about CUC is price. But everybody will acknowledge that the CUC provides a good service, there's easy access to it, there's no difficulty to get it, et cetera, wherever you are in the Cayman Islands. Similar with water. People don't complain about the quality of the water that they're getting, right? In fact, they don't even hardly complain about the price of the public water unit. There's complaints from the private water company. But the space that we get the complaints from and that we believe needs to be addressed urgently if we are going to respond to the complaints we get is in your sector, the telecom sector. And therefore, we, as a Public Accounts Committee, I believe have a special interest in trying to help you get the resources that you need in order to be able to regulate the industry and provide the kind of supportive as well as punitive regulation when it is necessary that the industry needs to remove these roadblocks so people can get what is, as the member from Bordentown West said, what is becoming increasingly important, right? I mean, I don't have to tell you, you're a technician, the people in my constituency, when the school had to go because of the COVID lockdown to home stuff, it wasn't easy. People got held back and had difficulty connecting. I mean, in my own household, my high school student, right, could not be on the same line as my primary school student, and both were not interrupted, right? And worse, if I tried to go on a Zoom call, I mean, all I got on the screen is your internet is unreliable, your internet is unreliable. I can hear people, but you know, you keep going through that little thing that goes round and round, right? I'm almost seasick from watching it. So I think that in the public interest, this committee, as representatives of the people, have a particular interest in seeing that your sector gets the resources that it needs in a very expedient fashion, so that you can deal, because the complaints that we get from the people you're regulating, particularly C3, is the speed at which you can respond to them, and while they're investing money, but the money is being tied up because you don't have the resources and the ability to respond in a timely fashion. So just want to confirm that that's where you need the help.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
The thing about it is, as you said earlier, that you know, people are lining up, they want to do investments, they want to do investments in the BRAC. The truth of the fact is, before liberalization, everybody was saying the same thing. And here we are 16 years later, and the BRAC isn't where it even should be. So then the question is, at this rate, even in the next 32 years, if we can get done in 16, the first 16, and the market has substantially changed then between the financial crisis and all of these different things happening, and we're seeing people now who once had deep pockets, deep pockets no longer having deep pockets, then, you know, it's good when they say they want to do it, but what we have found is they have reached in, they have cherry-picked what they needed to cherry-pick, and then those in the quote-unquote other parts basically get messed over. But it has been dealt with, or it's been dealt with. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the COVID response that was being offered by some of the telcos. Did any of those responses came through you guys? Like, did you guys reach out to them? Like, both Digicel and Flow in particular, what was it that they did offer the public, if any?
I'm glad you asked the question, Mr. Chairman, because all too often the industry gets a black eye for the bad things, or that tends to be the thing that is most often and vociferously spoken about. But the industry does a lot of good as well. And when the pandemic caused us to shut down, I reached out to the CEOs of the 4 telcos, and we came up with a program called Keep Cayman Connected, where the telcos basically agreed that they would not disconnect any customer for non-payment for 60 days. We also reached out to the telcos and asked them then to make sure that calls to the National Emergency Operations Center hotline were free, no charge, regardless of where you're calling from. That was done. We also asked them to, on the mobile providers, to make sure that if a customer was trying to reach gov.ky to get information about the coronavirus or the latest regulation, and the new website that was created, explore.gov.ky, that the data that they would use on their mobile phone to connect to those two websites would be free. And to their credit, without hesitation, the two mobile providers stepped up to do that. On our side, we worked with Chief Officer Bush and the new ministry that he has. They were assigned the curfew time responsibilities. We worked with them to create online forms, streamline the process, automate the process. So my team was involved in working with them on those. And then we also, about a month in, worked with the telcos on a relief package because they had very little cash coming in. So we created a relief package where we could defer the royalties portion of their license fees to later on in the year to free up cash flow. The unspoken agreement was, don't fire any people. Keep your staff employed, and we'll continue to work with you on these. And we also then worked with the, I believe Flo would have mentioned this, the Ministry of Infrastructure, to create a series of Wi-Fi hotspots. We even invaded the chairman's office in Northside to create these Wi-Fi hotspots using equipment that was donated to us by Cisco and bandwidth that was provided free of charge and still is by Flo to create across the islands, all three islands, a network of 10 Wi-Fi hotspots so that people who didn't have a job or didn't have an income or didn't have access to the internet, the coffee shops were closed, they couldn't necessarily go get any Wi-Fi anyplace, would have places that they could go. We designed it such that it operates in the parking lot, so you can maintain social distancing. You don't have to go into a building. You can stay outside and get connectivity. Again, that was working with both the ministry and service providers. So there have been any number of things, including cybersecurity. We saw worldwide there was a spike in cybersecurity attacks where the hackers realistically realized that lots of these IT folks were pulling their hair out trying to figure out how to reconfigure their entire network so that all the staff could work from home, which their networks were never designed to do. So we had spikes of cyber security attacks coming in. And we worked with the ISPs, the internet service providers, to identify the most serious threats and to block them at the country level. So they weren't even getting in. So we didn't have to, in other words, reach out to every single IT manager in the Cayman Islands and say, you need to upgrade your firewall, you need to put this in, that in, the other in. We could just block it right at the country level and secure everyone. So there were so many projects and initiatives during this lockdown process where the private sector and the telcos, ourselves and the government work together, and it just things you don't hear about.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that because I know one local bank promised people mortgage deferment, and then they have people in Bahamas calling them, telling them their mortgage is behind. No, it's this thing that, yeah. Yeah. Just one last thing that kind of jumped out at me. From a regulatory standpoint, the staff at your licensee, do you guys have to approve any of those staff or any positions that has to be approved by, say, your department or OFREG? Like, for example, in SEMA, for example, the managing directors or the CEO of banks have to be approved by SEMA. Does the same apply in your industry?
It's not as prescriptive as you described with SEMA. Our law requires that only fit and proper persons can be licensees. So we need to do due diligence on the body corporate and the beneficial owners and directors before a license can be granted. We don't approve a change of a CEO, for example, but it is up to us to make sure that we do some quiet background checks and due diligence on the senior leadership to make sure that those leaders within our licensees are, as the law says, fit and proper persons.
Yeah, well, I brought it up for two reasons. Well, one, the country manager for Flowers couldn't make it, and we understand for family emergency purposes. But there was a time where Cable and Wireless was pretty much 100% Caymanian in terms of on the leadership side. And I mean, then I noticed even on the digital side, we had the first Caymanian CEO, Raul, but I saw from media reports that he had resigned, and I think he was senior advisor to the board or something like that. So I was just a bit curious in terms of, we have these hearings, and granted that one was family related, why they couldn't have made it, because I'm sure the country manager would have come if he could. But it just mere coincidence that basically neither of the major telcos, CEO / general manager / country manager, had made it. So I'm just a bit curious in terms of, what that relationship was like, or what involvement you guys would have as regulators in that regard, in terms of senior leadership. But like I said, the market is fully liberalized, so I was just curious in that regard.
We do have a very good relationship with all of our licensees, though. I mean, we don't agree on a lot,
I would hope so.
but that's the nature of the relationship. But we, during COVID, for example, during the lockdown, I was in contact with the CEOs on almost a daily basis to provide updates, to hear what their concerns were, what challenges they were facing, and to assist them and each other to make sure that the networks were as resilient as possible, because the economy relies on it.
Okay, one last question for me, and this again goes back to the staffing issue. One of the things that the Auditor General had raised in our report was the executive director in terms of membership on the board. Now, I was going through the law, and I was trying to figure out if the quorum for the off-reg board includes the exec directors attending.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so based on the ratio that we have, it's a very strong possibility that if the executive directors do not show up, it basically means there's a very slim chance that you may not even make the quorum.
Yes.
Because what is the quorum for the board is what?
You have to have a majority of the non-executive directors, and I believe the law says at least 2 executive directors must be present, which would include the CEO.
Okay, so if you guys decide you're going to revolt or whatever, then there's a possibility that you may not meet the quorum requirement. If you're sick or something like that, decide to sick out. Not that you guys would do something like that. But then it leads me to the next question, then going back to the Auditor General's report and going back to governance and everything. She raised the issue of the executive directors being on the board. Now, we're used to having ex officio members and non-vote members on the board, but now we have a law specific that requires executive directors to be there, which kind of really is what jumped out at me. The question, and I just like your feedback in terms of having sat there now in a 7-hour board meeting for your 15 minutes, which leaves you 6 hours and 45 minutes to really listen to some extent. In your opinion, how do you think the board can be a little bit more effective? Do you think that the executive directors, first of all, should be members of the board? And then what do you think needs to be done on a board level that you think would make the board more effective and more efficient? No, if you're going to get yourself in trouble, because I noticed shortly after you left there the last time, I saw your job in the newspaper, so if you're going to get you in trouble, I can release you from responding. I just want you to know.
I'm a big boy. I remember working with J.P. Morgan, who not only was he our first CEO, but he worked with the ministry to draft the law. And what J.P. was trying to accomplish when he created this very unique structure that we have, and the Auditor General is right by pointing out that it doesn't exist anyplace else in other SAGCs. He wanted to fix what he saw as weaknesses and problems elsewhere around the region in other regulators, where the advice and the expertise of the professionals within the office was not necessarily filtering up to the board to help guide debate and decision making process. So he kind of went to the extreme of making sure that the executive directors not only are advisors to the board in their area of expertise, but sit on the board, albeit as non-voting members. So I understand where JP was coming from in structuring the law that way, but I also read the observation that the Auditor General had in that it blurs the line between the board's role for governance and the CEO's capability to basically discipline his folks when he's sitting right there next to folks who work for him. The board has discussed this at length, and the board feels that the board actually agrees with the Auditor General's recommendation that the law should be changed. I don't see a problem with it. I would very much like to get those hours back every board meeting. And what I've pointed out to one of the board members who spoke to me about it was that, look, every board relies on the chief financial officer to provide professional and honest advice and guidance. Whether or not that person reports to the CEO or whatever, they don't typically sit on the board as a member of the board, but they are expected to be called in and provide their professional advice any given day. There's no reason why we can't play a similar role as executive directors and be called to provide input, presentations, advice to the board as and when is needed. In my view, that's my
No,
opinion.
that's fine. The reason why I choose to raise it is if you have 4 executive members on a board, 1 CEO, and 3 of his employees, if you have a CEO with a very strong personality, just as though the non-executive directors get together and have their meeting, I'm assuming that the CEO also gets together and have his management meeting. And if those 4 technical professional people decide they're going to go into that boardroom and they're going to hold a hard and, as they say in domino, and say, this is what we want, their ability to influence the board is greatly enhanced when you got 4 people singing from the same hymn sheet versus another 5 or 6 non-executive directors that basically come individually. Now, I'm glad to see that the non-executive directors are meeting, or well, most of them are meeting to at least to get on the same page, which I think is good. But I also have to look at the flip side. If you have 4 people, 1 of which can decide and 3 follow, to say, well, you know what? With the right personality, that scenario can happen. You can then, in essence, now have the tail wagging the dog. And I think that is one of the things that we need to be wary of. And we have seen in some institutions where you have very strong personalities, very unique personalities, and in some cases, very egotistical personalities too. And that in itself also can have its own detrimental effect. I can understand the concept where you have multiple industries that you are regulating. It'd be nice to have some level of consistency, because if you're sitting there and you hear fuels debating doing one thing, you can say, wait a minute, guys, we tried that in IC or ICT, we looked at it, it didn't work, because whereas you may have your different sections inside there, to the public and to the licensees, you're still on the one reg, you're still on the off reg. And whatever is being done, granted you have monopolies in one, duopolies in others, and liberalization in the next, so it's not one size fit all. At the end of the day, there's got to be some level of consistency to avoid judicial review. So, and that's one of the things I was more careful of, because if you, like I said, I found Mr. Cummings to be quite, I don't use the word mild-mannered, but quite relaxed to some extent. And I even commented publicly that, I know some of the personalities on the board. I know the personalities of his first report. And let's be honest, they're very strong personalities, both on the board level and on your executive director level. Then, there's this, I'm stuck somewhere in the middle between the two, and that's an untenable position for anyone to be in. And then at the same time, too, part of the board remit is also governance of the CEO and pretty much his work. So to sit down there and have a very frank discussion with him on the performance of people that report to him, when you need at least one more to be there to have a quorum, is really a problem. I mean, how do you sit down and then have an official meeting discussing that issue? And if one has to be present, either just speaking about you and the other one is out the room. The bottom line is, at that level, someone else is hearing what is being discussed about somebody else. And I think that is really unfair, and I think that's one of the things that need to be looked at. So I hope, at least from the committee standpoint, as we make our recommendations, those are the kind of stuff that we do consider. Mr. Chairman.
Not, Mr. Ali, we can let you out an hour early so you can go back to your Friday evening activities. Thank you very much. And again, on behalf of the committee, I want to say that we appreciated your forthrightness, the way you have answered the questions, and we really appreciate it, and we wish you well, and we will do our best to offer whatever assistance we can to get you the resources to do the job you need to do. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to add for the record, and we're also keeping an eye on that whole recruitment process, because I don't like the timing of it, that you come down here, you give testimony, and then I see the application. I don't like it, so just whoever's, if they're cooking something, I just want them to know it's being looked at. All right.
The committee is adjourned, Senator D.